today. We weren't able to quite finish our bridling demonstration because we ran out of light yesterday. So you got to see how to put the Snaffle bridle on and how to adjust it. And today we're going to talk about, Ruth is going to teach me how to put a double bridle on and check that the adjustments are correct. So Ruth, I have Moshi back and he's on the cross ties. What do I do first?
The first thing you want to do is organize your bridle in both of your hands, okay, so that you get it ready before you start unhooking him. And I like to pull my noseband out of the way first, and then I take the reins in my right hand, put the reins over his neck and head, both double and snaffle rein, drop one cross tie, reins over first, and then you're going to unhook the halter, but always unhook it from this cross tie. Don't ever let your halter drop hook to the cross tie, because it could be a safety issue if he or another horse came through and stepped in it.
Oh, right.
Okay, so this is good that you brought the reins up closer to his head so that you would have control of him. Now you'll take the halter off and you'll wrap your right arm around the front of his nose, and I'll take your halter for you. And then you'll position the bridle through your right hand so that you're holding it at whatever height you need necessary. You'll put the bits in the palm of your hand, making sure that the bridoon is closest to him, because that's how you want it in his mouth. So that's the way I do it. I put my thumb through the bit ring here and I lay it out the way I want it in his mouth. And then I bring it up to his lips gently and ask with the little corner of my thumb to open, good boy Moshi, and then gently pull it up and push the ear forward through. Be careful, making sure that you look after the tack around his eyes. Very good. And then while you're coming back around, like you just automatically did there, a lot of people forget to do that. They don't make sure that the brow band is straight, and they don't make sure that the noseband or the Cavesson is straight. So from that side, you start to tuck in your Cavesson, and we'll check the fit of it as we go along. And then you'll do the Cavesson first. And how to judge how tight this is, okay? I will get that question all the time. The way the noseband works and why we have a noseband on is that when we use the rein, we want the horse to accept the rein contact in the bit. A lot of times if you pull on the snaffle or you're using an indirect rein or a flexion rein, the horse wants to open his mouth. And when they open the mouth, the hinge of this bottom jaw drops back. And therefore they can evade the contact with the bit. So when we have the noseband properly tightened, which is snug, not really tight, but not gaping, when the horse tries to drop the contact or drop the bit, the jaw cannot drop open, and it puts pressure on the bridge of the nose so that it prevents them from opening their mouth and spitting the bit out, is what we call it. And once they get used to that, it actually helps them relax at the jaw and the poll.
Right.
So go ahead and tighten your noseband until you feel like maybe you could put a finger or two through anywhere along the side of his nose or underneath his chin. And remember that pad we talked about.
Right.
You want to make sure that that is absolutely perfectly aligned over both of his jaw bones, that there's equal pressure behind. Yep, that's great. Equal pressure behind and no wrinkles and no skin. And you know, a lot of horses have a lot of extra flabby skin here from their cheek. You have to make sure that this is all laying really flat and nice. And this is perfect amount of chin pad. You can see that it fits right across the bridge of his lower jaw so that there's equal pressure on the most prominent part of his jawbone.
Yeah.
Okay, so now the throat latch. And like we said before in the snaffle demonstration, the throat latch needs to be snug enough that you could put maybe 4 fingers or your thumb or your fist. Yeah, that's perfect, because when he comes onto the bit and he flexes at the pole, this distance is going to close, and you don't want to have him catching this or pinching or cutting off any breathing supply there, okay? So then we're going to have a look at the curb chain, and the first thing you can see, this happens all the time, is that your curb chain hook has flipped forward. So let's show how that comes back around. And I want everybody to notice that this curb chain hook is put on correctly. You see how it's facing forward of the horse? A lot of times if it's put on backwards, and I'll show you a demonstration of that in a minute, if it's flipped around, your snaffle can get caught in that.
Right.
And that could be, number one, dangerous. It can also, this could be sharp on the horse's face, on the side of the horse's face. And I can see too that you've got your bridoon on correctly, and this is one of those KK Ultras with the directional arrow. This is on his left side, and it's facing forward. So I'm just going to check again from the front, and we're just going to look, and everything looks parallel. And we talked about earlier that the brow band shouldn't be too small so that it doesn't pull his cartilage on his ears. So we can see that this is not really super tight. And we can see that this is also not tight, but snug enough that if he opened his mouth maybe a ½ inch or more, it would put pressure on the bridge of his nose where the bone is still bone. Now just below this, and on Moshi you can feel it very clearly, if you're running your hand down the bridge of his nose, there's like a little lump, and then all of a sudden it gets narrow. That is where the cartilage starts in the horse's nose. So we want to make sure that this Cavesson is running parallel around his face, that it's just a finger or two below the bottom of his cheekbone, and definitely not so low with the Cavesson or with a Cavesson with a flash for a snaffle bridle that you would never have it lower than this sort of end of the regular bone of his nose before it gets to the soft tissue and the cartilage. So now we're going to talk about...
Can I just say something about, about that also, about the adjustment here when you say not so low so that we're not on the cartilage. Also, with these two bits, if you have the noseband on too low, not as Ruth said, only 1 or 2 fingers below the end of the cheekbone, you're going to get sores right in here. If the noseband and when you go to use the snaffle bit, the bridoon, are too close together, your horse is going to get pinched and you're going to get some sores there. And I also want to mention, you saw us put the snaffle on yesterday. This is exactly the same bit that Moshi has on his snaffle. So when he was first learning to go in a double, he already has to learn some new additions and adjustments, and we're adding a complication. So I want to have as few complications as possible. So I keep the snaffle bit, also called the bridoon in the double bridle, exactly the same. And as Ruth had said earlier, the only difference is that the ring is smaller because now we have more in his mouth. But what he feels in his mouth is identical to what he's used to feeling when he just has his snaffle bridle on.
And that leads me to say, too, that's exactly why we have a smaller ring for the bridoon, is because you could, if this was a larger ring and we had all of this here, or we had a much thicker pad, this is going to get hung up on a lot of this equipment. And that also leads me to say, Jane, that sometimes, you know, when you put those foam pads underneath the chin, these are really great, except if they're too long, okay? If your extra pad comes up here, not only are you kind of bulging out the sides of your cheek pieces, their teeth are right here. They need clearance and mobility for their molars. So if you have padding that comes up very thick all the way to here and you think it's nice and cushy, it's actually adding less space or taking away space for the molars and the chewing, the proper chewing to develop that we want inside. So it's really important that this all kind of lays flat and that you don't see these big bulges away. And also you can see, if we turn Moshi's face just a little bit to the camera, there's a nice space here between his cheek and the purchase of the bit. Okay, you see that on your side, Jane?
Yep.
This is really important, and we have, your purchases are great. They turn out just a little bit, and that also gives those premolars and those molars clearance for the bit. So if I was going to err on the side of too big of a curb or too small of a curb until I got the perfect fit, I would always go with one that was a little wider so that you're not pinching the gums and the lips and pushing against his teeth in there.
Yeah.
Okay? And
so when you talked about, I mean, this obviously has a cushion, it has a pad, it's protecting the bone here. But if I needed more padding and you said make sure it's not too long, what would be the ideal length to
The
cut it?
ideal length would be to come maybe an inch forward of his jawbone on each side, but no farther. You're really only trying to protect the bony protrusion of his bottom jaw, not around underneath your cheek pieces.
Right.
Okay, so maybe this one, if you were going to put another pad, it would be a ½ an inch longer on each side, or a total of 1 inch only.
Yeah. And I think that people have to be very aware, if you do put on an extra pad like that, and you think you have it centered, and then you go to tighten the noseband, it's going to shift. So you have to learn just by trial and error how to allow for that so that you don't end up with the entire extra cushion over to the left and nothing protecting the bone on the right. So you might have to start when you put it on with your little extra pad just slightly over to the right so that when you tighten the noseband it ends up right in the center.
Right.
Have you ever seen that happen?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and you end up with 3/4 of it
Yeah.
on your tightening
Yeah.
side.
And it's just trial and error
Yeah.
until you realize where you have to place it when you start it in order to adjust it. So like you said, it's tight enough to have an effect, but loose enough that the horse can chew and you can give him a little treat.
And I also want to talk about how high to put your curb in,
yeah.
okay? Moshi's is hanging quite well, and you can see when we use the Snaffle, we need it to be independent of the curb. Both of these reins are never used together. The Snaffle rein is for your lateral bending and flexion. Your curb bit can never be used for lateral left and right bending of any kind. So we have to make sure that there's plenty of space that between the bridoon, which should hang in his mouth the same way your Snaffle does,
Right.
just so that the bridoon sits in front of that first premolar on the bar. Then the curb sits slightly below that, but not so low that you would ever interfere. You see these teeth here? A lot of times I see the curb hanging so low that he can actually bounce it off of that canine, that tush there, which geldings have. Okay, so we want to make sure that there's plenty of space, you're a good boy, but that it doesn't drop down. If you hear clunking, not metal to metal, but another type of clunk, your bit could be hitting his teeth.
Right.
And you got to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, conversely, sometimes I see the curb bit pulled up so high that it actually looks like it's over the top of the Snaffle. Now, remember when we showed the curb has the curve of the port, the length of the Snaffle or the middle of the Snaffle should sit just inside towards him and below that.
Yeah.
So if your curb is pulled too tight, it's going to flip the reaction of the bit. Okay?
Yeah, I think, and in addition, if I can just say this, in addition to you know, talking about the lateral left and right flexion, that you need to be able to use the reins independently, you have to recognize that they have a different job, the reins. The Snaffle bit is basically, it can have a head raising effect, and the curb bit can have a head lowering effect. And a lot of times people use the reins in order to, I'll put this in quotes, put the horse on the bit, and they end up just pulling on all the reins to get that head lowering effect. But you want to be sure that your horse goes honestly on the bit in the Snaffle before you put him in a double bridle, because you want to play those reins delicately, like a concert pianist. You don't want to be using that curb rein for its head lowering ability and use that to pose as if your horse is round and on the bit. If anything, when you get to the point that you're able to put the double bridle on, you'll be using the reins even in a more refined way, like I said, like a concert pianist, just delicately playing independently on the reins.
Great. So our last piece is to do the curb chain.
Right.
And we left the best for last because there's always so many questions about that. So this is your bridle, so you know how you like to put the curb chain on. Why don't you do that, and then we'll talk about why it is that you have it that way.
Okay, so right now I have the curb chain on the right side on the second link. You can see that. And I know, just because I ride him every day, that when it's adjusted correctly, I'm on the second link on this side. Now, how do I know if it's adjusted correctly? When I do decide to use the curb, if it's adjusted at the right tension, when the curb chain comes against his face here, against his chin, notice the angle of the shank of the bit is about a 45-degree angle. That's correct. Now, a lot of times people think when they're starting with a double bridle that they're being really kind to the horse if they put it on the loosest link. And I don't have a lot of extra looseness, but I'm putting it on the first link. But notice what happens when you put it on, and in the beginning you're not going to be sure what's the right tension. So I have it on a little too loose, but I check while I'm still tacking my horse up. And you can see in order for the curb chain to come against his chin, now the shank of the curb bit is at about a 60-degree angle. And that changes the effect of the bit in his mouth. Now let's go to the other extreme if I'm able to do this. I'm going to make it too tight. And I'm going to put it on the third link. And in order for the curb chain to come against his chin here, you can see that the shank of the curb bit is only coming back about 15 degrees. So perfect amount for it to come back is that 45-degree angle.
I'm going to just make an addition to that. When I see curb chains that are too tight, which is often, a lot of time it's because people are having trouble. They think keeping their horse on the bit, so they tighten the curb chain, so they think they're getting more use of the curb. But then what happens, like we talked about a minute ago, the curb comes into effect so early and the horse tries to get away from it, then they open their mouth. Then guess what? All those horses with the tight curb chains also have an over-tightened noseband. So it's a little bit of a telltale that if the horse isn't accepting the contact correctly, whether if you're trying to compensate for that by over-tightening your noseband when you have also an over-tightened curb chain. So the two kind of go hand in hand.
And I know that you're going to talk about this a little later, but I'm going to slide this curb chain guard up. And this is another thing that I see very often. I will see this, if you could zoom in on this, where the curb chain ends up being twisted. What you want to always do is you want to make sure that when you think you have it right, you do an extra quarter turn so that the curb chain lies flat against the horse's face. That's another very common thing, that people don't do that extra quarter turn. So, and then another thing to think about for this particular length of curb chain, so like I said, I'm on the second link on each side, and you could actually, if you had a curb chain that was a little bit longer, you could be on the third link on one side and the second link on the other side. But you don't want to get a curb chain that is so long that you have 5 or 6 extra links hanging down, because it's going to be very distracting. You're going to hear metal on metal clanking away. So 2 and 2, or third link and second link, I think is pretty close to ideal. Do you have any feelings about that?
No, I definitely like that. And you know, you can buy them at different lengths. I would always buy sort of the medium to the longer, because then I could cut a link off if I had to.
Good point.
But I wouldn't go short, because then you never know. You never have that extra space to make sure you're at 45 degrees.
Yeah.
So, and the other piece is if your curb chain's way too long, you can see that the distance in the end links is wider than the links that actually go over his chin.
Yeah.
There you go. So it's much easier to put it on when you have these extra spaces than if you had a way too long and you cut it short and then you were trying to hook it up in here. I've seen that too.
Yeah, good point.
And it's really hard to make your curb chain lay flat if you're trying to hook your curb chain hook to one of these closer links. So it has to be on one of these separated ones. That's what it's made for, like that.
Cool. All right.
Okay.
So, what do you think? Does he look
I
good
think
to
he
go?
looks ready to go. Let's check it all out again. Make sure all the keepers are done and that the noseband is parallel and the bit's correct, and he's looking ready to do the Grand Prix, Jane.
Oh, goody. I'm going to do it bareback though, right? So I'm going to take Moshi out, and maybe you can get into this whole curb chain thing a little bit more for people. Okay.
I will do that.
Come on, Moshi.
Melissa, if you could come in and... So now Melissa and I want to talk a little bit more in depth about the curb chains and how to pick out a curb chain and how to put on a curb chain. And a lot of people don't realize that there is a left and a right and an upside and a downside of the curb chain. So we're going to show that demonstration. Set these for you for a moment. This is normal curb chain, how it comes from the tack store. And you can see that there's a link in the middle. This is called the fly link, and that is where the lip chain would go through to help stabilize your curb. Now, Melissa, this is going to go, that link, on the bottom side or the downside closest to the ground when you put it on. But how do you know if you put it on this way or this way? Okay, and the answer to that is these curb links are made to roll and roll flat. Could I see your arm for a moment? When the curb chain is laying correctly, you will not see big bumps or lumps along this top edge. Okay, so this is correct. This is laying on her arm very smooth. You shouldn't feel any pinching of your skin or your hair in the links here of this. But if I turn it upside down, you can see that it doesn't lay as flat on her arm. You can see these little lumps at the top, because they're inside out basically, are not laying flat, and that would be pressed up against the horse's chin and could really give a good pinch. So we want to make sure that the fly link is aimed at the bottom, and remember that this is the horse's chin, and then it lays very softly down around the edge of his chin. And then when you go to turn it, like what Jane was talking about, you keep turning that all the way in that same clockwise direction until all the links are perfectly flat around, okay? So let's have a look at the other two, because not all curb chains are created equal. Now it's a little bit harder to see. I think I'll take this one out of its case. And it's just a good demonstration of how it goes in. You slide it in very evenly, and you have to keep turning and twisting them as you put it through your curb chain guard. Set this down. And you can see that the links of this one are different size and a different closeness than the links of that one. And this one's even different yet. So some horses prefer a wider surface area under their chin than others, and in fact they make them much wider than this. So you can also see, I'll put them in the same direction, that some of these curb chains are different closeness to the link. I prefer myself the ones like this where the links are a little bit tighter than these looser links. It really ensures that it's going to lay flat against the back of the horse's chin. And we'll just look at this third one as another example. This is the narrowest one I have and not my favorite. Get them all going in the right direction. And you can see that the interlaying locks are different on all of these. And you also have to try a little bit of trial and error to see which one your horse likes. Now, I have a kind of a neat introduction to how the curb works for people who always ask me, how does the curb bit actually work and affect it? How does it feel in the horse's mouth? So I am going to do a little demonstration with Melissa and her foot. And her foot is going to be the tongue of the horse's mouth. And we're going to show you how it is that this curb feels in your horse's mouth. Okay, remember that the tongue is a really long muscle, and it's very thick and fleshy at the back of the throat, and as it comes forward near the tongue, it looks like a tongue like what we're used to seeing. It's thinner, not as fat, and not as fleshy, but back in the horse's mouth and where the bits affect, it's very wide. So I want my riders to understand when they pull on the reins, especially on the curb reins by accident, the effect that it has on the horse's mouth and on its tongue in particular. So I'm going to hand this to you, and if you wouldn't mind taking your shoes off, we're going to pretend that Melissa's foot is the tongue of the horse. That's right. And so we're going to put the curb chain underneath the chin. And this, how it's laying on her foot, would be like the pressure of the port, which when you use the curb rein, folds down over the tongue. Okay, so this is hanging in a perpendicular, like if you didn't have anything touching the horse's mouth at all, it would hang perpendicular. All right, Melissa, we're not going to worry about how the curb chain's adjusted to your foot, but what I want you to do is pull on the curb rein like you're a rider and tell me what you feel on your foot.
It pinches.
It pinches. It pinches her tongue, which is her foot, between the curb chain and the port of the bit. And you know, that wouldn't be too long if Melissa kept a hold of that curb bit that her toes would start to go numb because she is pressing off the circulation. And that would be the same thing in your horse's mouth. So if your curb chain is too tight all the time and it is always pressing that port of the bit down on your horse's tongue, you are numbing his tongue, and sooner or later that tongue is going to get what we call like a dead tongue or a blue tongue, and it's going to hang out and it's going to be ugly and it's going to be a lot of resistance, and you get a lot of points off for that, as well as making your horse very uncomfortable. So we want to have, I see you released it because is your toes getting tired? Sorry. You can play with this with your own foot of how much degrees you pull on the rein when that comes into effect to really demonstrate the tact that you need when you use the curb rein of what that's doing inside your horse's mouth. So thank you very much for your tongue foot, and that is how I like to have my riders feel that for themselves, to have some empathy about how tactful you need to use the curb bridle. So thank you very much, and I hope that gives you lots of questions and answers. Jane, do you have any more questions?
I just noticed, I love that demonstration, but I noticed on this particular curb bit that these hooks look different than Moshi's hooks.
Yes,
Can you talk
thank you.
about that?
Yes, this bit was purchased with these curb length hooks put on facing the horse. And if you remember, we never want to have this facing the horse. It also doesn't stabilize your curb chain when you have it on. The snaffle bit could get caught in here, and we could have tack or cheeks being pinched. This should be taken off and flipped around so that this point of the curb chain hook is actually facing forward. And it will stabilize your curb chain, it will not have pinching, and you're really going to just have to look every single time. And this is a new bit, and I can't give an answer of why they come from the manufacturer that way. Some bits do, some bits don't, but you should always flip your curb chain hooks so that the point, the sharp point where it hooks into the link, faces the forward towards the horse's muzzle, never towards the horse's chin or chest. So anything else? Okay, so I think that does it, and we'll see you later with some more tack fitting.